poder comenzar la tercera mesa de debate, por favor. No, no hace falta. Por favor, por favor, por favor, pueden ir tomando asiento.
Can you take your seats, please? Thank you.
Sí, por favor, cuanto antes tomen asiento, antes empezamos la mesa, que luego yo estoy segura que en la parte de debate quieren hacer muchas reflexiones y si empezamos más tarde no vamos a tener...
Please take your seats, otherwise we are going to be even later or lagging even more behind. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias. Comenzamos. En primer lugar, quisiera...
Well, I would firstly want to thank the presence, as I already conveyed my thanks to the three speakers. I want to thank the institutes, the Women's Institute or the Institute for Women, and the possibility that they are giving us to moderate this table with these three contributions. I would like to say that after the opening session and the two sessions that we had this morning on the BEIJING+25 platform, and now we will have to speak about other reports on equal rights between men and women in Europe. And for this, we have representatives of the Council of Europe, of the entity called Women's Major Group, I think she said. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Firstly, we will hear Caterina, Mrs. Caterina Bolognese, the chief of the Gender Equality Division of the Council of Europe and Secretary of the Commission for Gender Equality. She has studied the situation of women in prison. Since 2018, she's the chief of the working group on gender issues. And she has been also dealing with one of the instruments that we are going to see now, which is the recommendation for the prevention and the combat against sexism. And then we will hear Sascha Gabizon, who belongs to Women's Major Group, a network that works over 50 countries. And you know this network, and I'm sure that she will give a response to many of your doubts. She defines herself as eco-feminist. She has always said that she felt fortunate for being able to participate in the 4th World Conference of Beijing, 1995, which was the seed of the organization through which these 20 years have been developed and sprouting. She's going to participate in the forum next year, which will take place in Paris and Mexico. And last but not least, at my left, we have Mrs. Isabel Caño Aguilar, the Vice President of the European Economic and Social Committee. And she is the responsible person for the communications since 2018. From 2010 to 2013, she was the observatory of this committee, or the responsible person of the observatory of this committee. She's an important person in the civil society. She also collaborates in the General Secretary of the Workers' Association. And I'm going to give the floor to the speakers, who will have 15 minutes. Caterina, a couple of minutes more, because she's going to show a video, and we will try to have a Q&A round or session at the end. Thank you, Caterina.
And
I'm going to speak in English, though I love your language, Spanish. I can't do it. I can't be effective enough yet in Spanish. So I'd like to salute the commitment of the Spanish government and of the very powerful civil society present here today, the commitment to gender equality and to furthering the platform for action, the Beijing commitments, as has been said, were so ambitious but remain to be fulfilled. So what does the Council of Europe what can the Council of Europe contribute to advancing the platform for action? Where do we stand as a 47-member state intergovernmental organization? Where do we stand in furthering the platform and the commitments? I think if you trace the history since Beijing, it's fair to say that progress has been very gradual, and I don't like to use the word slow because many instruments were adopted, recommendations and some tools, absolutely. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of concrete action, the Council of Europe has been catching up in the last 5 years or 10 years, let's say. We have a transversal program, which is very, very important because it brings together gender mainstreaming and a gender equality strategy and the intergovernmental work to implement that strategy and cooperation activities in what we hope is a more focused effort to further the gender equality agenda of the Council of Europe, but also, of course, of the Beijing Platform for Action. With this transversal program, basically we can address so many different parts of the organization that have contributed and still need to contribute more to concrete results. I can mention the Court of Human Rights. It's been very, very influential. Without some of the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, we wouldn't have had such a strong Istanbul Convention as well. So, but that's complaints-based, and we are also trying to get lawyers up to speed on awareness about violence against women and awareness about access to justice, so that actually the legal profession can bring cases nationally as well as to the court in Strasbourg. So we're on very many different ways. We through what we call the Golden Triangle, we have intergovernmental work, cooperation and assistance to help build capacity so that our member states and civil society are better equipped to apply the standards that we establish in this 47 member group. We can obtain more concrete results, but the major development is, of course, the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. The Istanbul Convention is hailed as this golden standard on violence against women and preventing and combating it, and only since the last 5 years that convention has come into force and has started working on monitoring, which is the third element of our golden triangle. So we have independent monitoring that is producing results on the what the states parties to the Istanbul Convention are actually doing and what they need to do more in order to abide by their commitments under their obligations under the Istanbul Convention. So I think you know the Istanbul Convention. I won't talk to you so much about the Istanbul Convention because actually I'd like to talk to you today about our new recommendation on sexism, which I think it became clear in our policy discussions since the adoption of the Istanbul Convention that actually we need to address basically our member states need more concrete, practical tools to address the environment and the attitudes that enable violence. So violence prevention and at an earlier stage, and that we think is sexism. And the work on developing a recommendation on combating and preventing sexism began in earnest, let's say, in early 2017, so before the explosion of the Me Too movement. But once a few months later the Me Too movement exploded, then what was a good idea became suddenly an emergency, basically. So I don't think, and there are some people in this room who actually participated in the drafting of this recommendation, of which we are very proud. And so I won't, you know, I will tell you a bit about the recommendation now. I mean, but before that, I want to just mention at the intergovernmental level, we have the gender equality strategy, which helped shape, let's say, make a framework for the policy work of the Council of Europe. In the first strategy, 2014 to 17, there were 5 objectives, and in the follow-up one, there were 6 strategic objectives. We added, in fact, and I wanted to mention this, the situation of migrant women as requiring particular focus, particular efforts in Europe. This region that is so challenged and that needs to learn of the opportunities as well that migrant populations present, but this intersection, the violence that is suffered, the economic issues suffered. That migrant women face, this are the subject of work that will come when we update our recommendation on the situation of migrant women, migrant asylum-seeking refugee women in Europe. This is in the next biennium we will produce this because it follows from the new strategic objective on migrant women. So the first strategic objective is all about sexism and gender stereotypes. And so the result of work on that I will mention now. The recommendation, it contains the first ever internationally agreed legal definition of sexism. It covers this definition, and I can show you if I can see. Oh, here we go. This is a page, by the way. The address is www.coe.int/stop-sexism. Maybe I can show it to you later, but I think this doesn't quite work. Maybe the... I'm trying to move to the center. Oh, I see. Okay, I'm not left-handed though, so oh, I see. We adopted the recommendation. I have a few copies of it, but we're paper conscious, so I encourage you to see it online. The recommendation on sexism contains this definition. It's a longish text, but it's fascinating and makes for good reading and it exists also thanks to the Spanish government in Spanish as well. I think you were the first country to translate it into a language other than our official language, so I want to commend the Spanish efforts in this respect. We have the first definition of sexism. Now, this isn't the full text. I'm putting it up on the screen. It's not the full definition. It's a longer definition, but it covers all kinds of behavior or expressions in any context based on the idea that a person or a group of persons is inferior because of their sex. For the act, statement, or behavior to qualify as sexist, its purpose or effect must be to violate dignity or rights. It must cause harm or suffering. It must create an environment that is, for example, hostile. It must undermine a person's or a group's autonomy or human rights, or it must maintain and reinforce gender stereotypes. All of these are not cumulative. It has to qualify for one of these categories to qualify as sexist. So this is the definition. I encourage you to go and see it in full in Spanish if that's helpful. So last week, in order to make our new recommendation more readable and to reach out and also engage with civil society and with the wider public, we launched this new action page, we call it. It's just a dedicated page on the new recommendation. So it contains the definition. There's a video that I'm going to show you in a moment. But what's really interesting, apart from, this figures about gender inequality as a result of sexism or structural sexism, these figures are supposed to whet the appetite of someone who might be interested in the subject. So we have. What's very interesting is that at the very end of the page is all the various areas that where sexism manifests and where sexism, the implications of sexism are analysed. Here we go. This is a part about intersectional, which is very strong, intersectional discrimination, multiple discrimination. That is interesting too, the fact that it also it affects men. But what I wanted to show you is this last section, basically. So you can see all these different areas in which the recommendation addresses each area and asks, how does it manifest? So you see examples of sexism. It explains why these kinds of sexism should be addressed. And then it goes into the concrete measures that should be taken, that could be taken, or that must be taken by member states and by also independent institutions or even the private sphere in order to address structural sexism. So that's this how to prevent it at the end. But just to be clear, we have, I'm sorry there's no cursor, but I'd like to switch if I can. How do I do that? I'm such a cliche with the technology, but it's a woman who's helping me, so that's good. Okay, so we have this, but I'd like to just, I won't click onto it then, but basically if you go onto the site, you can see there's a section on language and communication, so sexism as it manifests and as it should be addressed in that area, sexism in media, internet and social media, sexism in the workplace, in the public sector, all the institutions where sexism is ingrained and should be addressed, in the justice sector, in education, in culture and sport, and even in the private sphere. So it's a very rich text. It's a text that is challenging, But I mean, it's also a recommendation rather than a convention which is obligatory and requires ratification. The recommendation is what we call soft law, but what we want to do is now try to reach out to member states, but also to civil society in helping us make this recommendation a reality, not just something that gets put in somebody's drawer and forgotten, okay? And we want to harness the power of the people with this, and so that's why we've done a bit of a more user-friendly version. How are we doing? Yes. How are we doing for time? Good? Yeah. And to try to engage the wider public also in awareness about sexism, and so that people can see it, name it, and stop it. This is the slogan that we're using, and that we want to be used also in social media. And so I would leave you with a view of the video on the recommendation, and then I'd be very happy to take concrete questions also about other. Here we go. Let's see if I can maximize. Oh, eccoci qua.
It impacts women differently and to a greater extent than men. It's around us from childhood, with boys encouraged to run, jump and be active, and girls socialized into passive, pleasing, ladylike behavior. It hits out at us from bus stop advertising, magazine covers, toys, computer games, or pictures posted on the wall at work. It's there in the home, where women still perform far more unpaid work than men. It's in the workplace, where women are ignored and silenced, passed over for promotion, penalized for having a family. It exists each time a victim of sexual violence is told in a court that she was asking for it. It's present each time a sportswoman is portrayed as a wife and mother, or asked to conform to a girly, sexy stereotype, and her sports achievements are downplayed. It's there when girls drop out of sport because they're told they don't have the right body. It exists when men who look after their children are ridiculed. It exists every time politicians who are women are silenced by jokes or comments about their appearance. It spreads its poison through social media, with women and girls silenced and degraded through vicious, sexualized attacks. Sexism is not just an attack on women, it's an attack on everyone. It leads to societies that are not safe for everyone to thrive, with no space for diverse voices, talents, or leadership. At worst, it creates a climate that leads to violence and murder. That's why the Council of Europe has come up with the world's first legal text addressing sexism in all its forms. We're taking a stand against sexism. Will you?
Thank you, Caterina. Gracias, Caterina. Creo que...
Thank you, Caterina. I think that the video has been clear enough for the Q&A session. Now we give the floor to Sascha Gabizon, the manager of Women in Cairns for a Common Future.
Sí, hola feministas, lo siento mucho, voy a hablar en inglés.
Hello feminists, I'm sorry but I'm going to speak in English.
Really happy to be here. Thank you very much, Government of Spain, Instituto de la Mujer, UN Women for inviting me. And I'm here representing the women's major group, Grupo Mayor de Mujeres, I think you would translate that. We were created out of the idea that we need to have everybody involved in policy making, and that women were often not at the table, and that the UN, the United Nations, is with the people, for the people, but where are the women? So in 1992, at the Earth Summit, it was the first time that women's civil society organizations were giving their own space in the United Nations. And now if I go to a meeting with some of you have been there with us, we will sit behind a flag which says women, mujeres. So you'll have downstairs the heads of state, and upstairs you'll have women. That is the space for civil society women's organizations. It's a very important space. We have to make good use of it, but we are not funded. It's entirely self-organized. We have to find funds ourselves to participate and to make sure that we make this a useful, strong space for women's voices globally. I was in 1995 at the Beijing World Women's Conference. It was eye-opening. It made me the eco-feminist, which I am still, I hope. There were we 35,000 or so women from all over the world. It was a huge conference. And indeed with the most visionary Beijing platform for action. And I think we all have to be very angry and upset that 25 years after Beijing, we are seeing a rollback on women's rights, seeing the pressure on women human rights defenders, and you have to be in the streets, and we have to make our voices heard. And I was very pleased to see that in Spain, you have called for a feminist emergency, emergencia feminista, and that many of you were in the streets recently. And I congratulate that for you, and we need that everywhere in the world. And I think the coming year, where we will commemorate the important advances on the international women's rights agenda, that the coming year will need a lot of us in the streets. And the Women's Major Group is just a space through which we can get, hopefully, many of you involved in the official processes of the United Nations. I am here to tell you mostly about how we help to organize the regional civil society forum, which will be taking place in Geneva at the UN on BEIJING+25. So we are working closely together with UN Women, and I just put up our own website of my organization, which is called Women Engaged for a Common Future, because it has all the links. So if you go to wecf.org, you'll have all the links. To get involved and informed, first of all, please join our listserv. We have a listserv of the Women's Major Group in the UNECE region. We also have a global one. So globally, we're about 1,000 feminist organizations. And currently, I think we have 300 or so of you on the listserv for the UNECE region. And we ask you to, first of all, identify who you are, that you're not a bot from some strange organization which is anti-women's rights, but that you're really working for women's rights, and then you can join the listserv. Then you have two spaces where you can get more information about how to engage a civil society in the Civil Society Forum in Geneva on the 28th of October, which will be the day before the official UN United Nations meeting, which will be on the 29th and 30th of October. These are the regional preparatory meetings for the Commission on the Status of Women in March 2020. But they will also be for input throughout the year to also engage with our priorities in this Generation Equality Forum. So here you have the links how to register for the Civil Society Forum and for the UNECE Forum. The deadline for the UNECE Forum ends on Monday. Many of you will have problems if you have not yet registered, if you're planning to come, because you need to be accredited to the UN Economic and Social Committee. And if you are not registered, you have to be sponsored by one of the feminist organizations who are. So we are there, we can help you, you just need to put our name, but it's important to know. So if you need that, you need to contact one of our colleagues who will help you do the registration. The Civil Society Forum, we started working on it in March. We set the first deadline for the 20th of August. We already had almost 600 applications by the 20th of August. We left it open because we had some more requests from regions which were not well represented. So we have only closed it last week, Friday, and we have almost 700 applications, of which only 80 participants can be funded. Luckily, UN Women has put forward a lot of funding, but specifically for women from countries which are middle or low income countries. So almost 70% of the funds are going to participants from Central Asia, Caucasus, Eastern Europe, Balkan region, and luckily also a few from the EU region, but very few. And from Spain, I'm very sorry, we really had no funding for the Spanish feminists. So I hope you are getting organized and that maybe this meeting can also help get more support for the feminists who would like and want to participate. Many of you have registered. I have recognized many of your names. But now we just need to make sure that we can also have more Spanish feminists participate. You can also find the agenda there. It's a just one-day agenda, and that's not enough. So we have started to work already in groups to prepare our positions. So we're working in subgroups. We have 25 subgroups working on women and migration, women and climate justice, violence against women, gender-based violence, etc., etc. All of this, unfortunately, is in English. We're self-organizing, we have no funding for translation into Spanish, so that's a real barrier, I know. And what is very important also is that we work in global solidarity with the other feminist organizations. The same regional meetings are happening in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and in West Asia. And we're trying to make sure that we come with very strong recommendations from civil society, women's organizations, women's rights organizations, and that we do not contradict each other, and that we are working in solidarity. And of course, what we know is very crucial is the structural barriers and how women's rights and how they are put under pressure are linked to the economic system. And that the economic crisis you had in Spain and we had everywhere in 2008 has really been of great damage to women's rights. We heard it before. A lot of what we had created in institutions and in budgets has been taken away again. And we also see it with the link to the climate crisis. The gender emergency and the climate emergency are both based in our exploitative economic system. And that is a very clear understanding of all the feminist organizations participating in a women's major group. And it's also a way to hopefully bring more of the young feminists on board who are currently very much engaged in Friday for Futures. I came here yesterday during the immense demonstration happening on the streets of Madrid. It was very, very impressive. But we also see that a young woman like Greta Thunberg is being severely attacked on social media. And it's by sexism approaches and by putting her down as a young woman for not being obedient and not being nice to heads of state. And I think we have to understand that this is a joint fight we are fighting. But the exploitative economic system is, of course, also at the root cause of the terrible situation for migrant women in the world. And the sexual exploitation, many of them are also faced with. There were reports also on migrant women working in the agriculture sector in Spain with structural sexual abuse. And we know that we need this change of economy where we go to a decent work transition with decent jobs for women and men in all their diversity. And of course, therefore, we call for examples like we got from Spain. I mean, I know you have been doing wonderful work with the coal mines and trying to have a just transition to bring people out of the sector of fossil fuels and into the new future. But we need much more of that, and we need to do this much more with women. So support local women's cooperatives, support women farmers, women entrepreneurs, and the best way to do that is through tax justice. So also from the Biarritz G7 meeting, there came 4 recommendations, which I think are very important. And you can cluster them in 2 groups. The group of legal changes and the group of fiscal changes. We need to address the many discriminatory laws and norms which we still have. We heard not one country in the world has achieved gender equality before the law. That's our first step. Then the second step is create these new laws which we need for this just transition and this gender equal world. But then you can have them. I was just in Bolivia, and I was really impressed because they have a new institution to end the patriarchy, and it sounds great, but it has no funding. Yeah. So even though we might have the laws and the institutions, and we have seen it, if we then don't put the budgets, we will not make any advances. So what we just heard before from our colleague from EIGE, that the women's civil society organizations need to work on the budgets, on monitoring the budgets and being involved in how the EU budget is being created and our national budgets is essential. Put the funding in the necessary transition of the economy and put the funding in your women's rights civil society organizations. We know that they are the motor for change and they have been completely underfunded. We know that several member states in the EU are already looking at that they have a feminist government, a feminist foreign policy, that they are setting targets to have 50, 80, or 100% of their funding being gender transformative or gender positive. These are very good steps, but often the actors find it very difficult to know what to do. So there's a lot of awareness raising still needed. And of course, the work you are doing with the European Council is essential to help also understand what does it mean in your day-to-day life in your office, and that the stereotypes and the sexism which we are confronted with every day are maybe one of the biggest barriers. And it's also a problem for the public. I mean, I live in Germany at the moment, where you have a very strong right-wing party called the AfD. They're getting more and more votes. And they're using our language. They will do demonstrations in the streets and say, we are for women's rights. And then when you start talking to them, it says, yeah, because we have to defend our women from the migrants, and then they go into the anti-migrant language, and then they go into, and then it becomes very clear that, you know, they are not at all feminist, and they're not at all protecting or fighting for women, human rights as we have them in our legislation, that they're even trying to undermine existing legislation. But for the general public, this fake news is very confusing, and we have to speak out on it. So, like we just heard, see it and stop it. And speak out against it. And also speak out against the countries who are doing this. Previously, we heard that not all the EU countries have submitted their reports for BEIJING+25. Well, indeed, I looked at the list. Poland is not there. We know that Poland is indeed a very problematic country in Europe. Every time we have to take a common stance as EU member states, we always have this barrier of having to deal with some member states who are really trying to roll back on women's rights language. Even in Hungary, we hear that they have tried to take the word gender out of school books, and that they have stopped any activities which are related to gender equality education. So we need to speak out to it in our region and in our countries and in our daily life. And so for the women's major group, we have also looked at the process of Beijing+25 and for the upcoming conferences in Mexico and France. And we said we need some benchmarks. And for example, we already heard you have also set criteria for that, very good criteria. And indeed, for example, a country which has not ratified CEDAW should not be at the table. But luckily, there's very few who haven't, but the USA is one of them. So they are not invited, we would say, right? You also need to reconfirm, all the countries need to reconfirm their commitments to the Beijing Platform for Action, all the reviews, and all the new international agreements we have obtained in the area of women's rights, such as the new ILO convention to end sexual abuse and exploitation in the workplace. So we really need to make sure that those who are engaged are really taking the commitments. And I think I have 1 minute left. The South African minister last week at the General Assembly of the UN said, we have to go even further. Countries who cannot commit to parity in their parliaments and governments, they should also not be invited to be at the table. So, I mean, but we have to be strong. We have to set high standards for this Beijing celebration. And of course, the essential thing is about tax justice, fiscal justice, pushing for that, and being coherent with those who are active. If we invite corporations to be at the table, of course we will need, you know, the private sector to become engaged, but we want them to also be coherent. And not on the one hand, pretend they're doing something good on feminism and gender and women's rights, but on the other hand, maybe be very destructive in their activities, economic activities, which lead to further exploitation of women in the global south. So that coherence is essential. Therefore, we can already let you know that there will be a very big women's strike on the 8th of March, and we will be focusing on the structural barriers we need to overcome. If you have any further questions after this meeting about the CSO forum in Geneva or anything else, I'm also making the link to the global process of the Generation Equality Civil Society Advisory Group. Please come and see me, and I'll be very happy to speak to you and had many more things to tell you about things we should be doing, but I think my time is up. So let's be engaged, work in solidarity, and I look forward to being in contact with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sascha. Realmente una intervención muy inspiradora. Antes
What an inspiring speech. Before giving the floor to Isabel Caño, I would like to say that from the Secretary of State of Equality, we will send the European Council video so that you can have it, because it's really revealing. So without further ado, Isabel, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to say thanks, first of all, to Rocío Rodriguez. You hear me? Yes. Rocío Rodriguez, who is the manager of the Institute for Women, and for equal opportunities, for inviting the Social and European Committee to participate in this forum, an important forum, a Generation Equality, that takes place at a very specific moment of the internal life of the Social Economic Committee. I'll have the possibility of conveying it later on. I think it's important that we are all here, so many women that represent so many different associations of civil society and feminist movement, because many times, and I think that we need to remember that, we forget that the 7 SDGs.
Lo siento, tengo un poco la garganta perjudicada, intentaré hablar más cerca del...
I have a very sore throat. I'll try to speak closer to the mic. I said that within the 17, SDGs, we forget that the 17th goal to create alliances is one of the main goals and a very powerful instrument to accomplish the other 16 goals. For every single goal, it is important, but I think that for the goal number 5, that is the one that affects us, although it's not the only one, I think that is key, and I think that women know how to create alliances. The committee is a consultancy organism of the European Union, and as such we work in close collaboration with the European Union, with the presidency and with the European Parliament. Well, I think that I'm not here to speak about institutional politics. We can do it in both ways. The Commission, the Council, or the Parliament can request us a report, but we also have the possibility of writing down a report that is called an initiative report. It is the case of the last report that I think is the one that brings me here today, that is called gender equality or matters related to gender equality. It's not easy, or it has not been easy to implement this report, not only because of the content, but also because of the configuration of this report. These reports have to be approved, have to be passed, and sometimes our colleagues at the Economic and Social Committee in Europe don't think that gender equality has to be tackled in a particular way, or they think that this gender equality has been accomplished on EU scale. So this is the first barrier, internal barrier, that is very difficult to overcome. But I have to say that both the speakers and everybody that had the opportunity of taking the floor by then, we made this report possible. On average, women, the representation of women in the Social and Economic Committee is not very high. We are around 30%. We represent 3 groups at the committee. On the one hand, we have trade unions, we have the world of corporations, and thirdly, a group that has to do with other organizations of civil society, peasants organizations, consumers organizations, environmental organizations. So just to put an example, there's we are 21. There are just 5 women. At the different groups, we have 3 at the trade unions, 2 at the corporate group, and no women at the 3rd group. Organizations like, for example, that have to do with peasants, with farmers, with are mainly men.
El papel de la mujer es un papel que genera un enorme valor añadido, pero que en la
an added value, but the owners sometimes are men, the husbands, so to speak. But women usually work with their husbands, but they don't have either salary or social protection. So since 1958, when we created the Social and Economic Committee at a European level, we've had 15 presidents, out of which 12 or 13 have been men and only 2 women.
cifra realmente muy baja.
This is a very low figure, and I also wanted to use some figures that I used in the election campaign to the Parliament, the European Parliament, which in all its existence has only increased in 10 to 12% the presence of women, which means that in the first European Parliament there were like 10–12% women present, and according to previous mandate statistics, they were having a maximum of 30% women. And I'm surprised of the fact that after so many years of equality policies, we have not reached a higher representation of women. I think that 12% on the first European Parliament was due to the fact that the European Parliament was not considered an important institution, and this is why women came. But the moment it became important, then the lists were filled up by men. Another thing is on an internal level, which, well, we asked the Council to review their guidelines on the advice given to the European Economic and Social Committee. Some delegations have odd numbers. It's a mathematical issue, but we want to have a 40 to 60 representation at least. We are now working, and this is at the moment an informal group. We have a group of women and men in the committee in order to create an equality institution or organization. The committee does not have such an organization to regulate the policies in terms of the European policy. The Parliament does indeed have such an institution, the FEM institution, but we don't have such an institution. And we are working informally, but I think before 2020 we will be able to have any such structure that will deal with it. I'm going to give some examples of daily situations that we have. Study groups that have a good importance because we are having an emphasis or an impact on the legislative process where there is an evident lack of the presence of women, or other working groups where normally have men, or panels that only give the floor to men, and then the committee is tweeting and then appears in the official accounts of the European Economic and Social Committee. In 2018, we had, just to see the schizophrenia and the dichotomy, we were having an event on the 8th of March where we have projected or filmed the Dr. Mugabe film, The Man Who Repairs Women, with a round table with the presence of organizations of civil society and also from the world of cooperation, but also feminist organizations representatives. At the same time, the economic session of the committee was giving an audition on the economic and monetary session in a panel where only men were present. And this has happened at the same place practically and at the same time. I also wanted to say that this year we have an annual prize to the civil society. This year, the European Economic and Social Committee, under my proposal, because this is within my competencies, we have awarded this prize to the empowerment of women. Specifically, it is called More Women on the Economic and Social Environment of the European Union. The award has received all the candidatures, and we have had a record number, 170 candidatures of 27 state members, which is highly satisfactory because we will have, next December, we will have a award-giving session where we will surely have the presence of the President of the European Commission. I am not going to delve into why this prize is going to be awarded. I think that enough data have been presented in the committee. We face every day our legislative aspects, not only focusing on those points where it is important to have a gender analysis and presence, but we have been rather innovative. There are scopes or aspects such as transport, which is in the hands of men, but the committee has given its opinion or its decision on transport for women, and we had also an initiative on the role of women or the salary differences in terms of transport. How have we identified why the potential of women is not present in all social or economic scopes of the European Union? Well, I think that I would sum it up with just one sentence. Equality has mainly the face of a woman, but the gaps normally have also the face of a woman. Science, technologies, engineering, mathematics, artificial intelligence, which is one of the most important technological advances, although it is true that some robots have the voice of a woman, but this is it. I mean, normally the presence of women in the scope of AI is normally stops there. I mean, also the environmental crisis has the face of a woman. Also the salary policies have a face of a woman. Also salary gaps. And this has been mentioned here. This is one of the basic and essential issues. When I was mentioning the SDGs and I was mentioning goal number 5, well, I come from trade unions, and the General Workers' Trade Union has been working a lot on the salary gap. And I think this is something that is not going to be solved ever, or that seems to not to be solved ever. But the birth of equality policies is already present in the Treaty of Rome. So many years talking about equality policies. What has the Parliament said to us? Well, the Parliament during 2018 to 2019 has requested 4 opinions from us. Not the general initiative opinion, but we've had one on gender equality in the labor market, also the digital gap, and also women with some kind of handicap or disability, or the Roma women. As for the Commission, we clearly specified that we wanted a very clear gender equality policy. As for indicators, well, I just wanted to mention, well, I think there's only 2 minutes left for me. I would like to very briefly mention the next pluriannual or multi-annual financial framework. There's been some figures mentioned, but I think that we need to have a higher political commitment to increase not only funds, but also the general union budget. If we are to have a strategy, we need to endow the means, the financial means, to carry out this strategy and to implement it. We spoke about climate change and environmental issues. I think we are the only institution that has accepted the invitation by Greta Thunberg, and I think I agree with Sascha. She is a woman that, due to being so young and due to her condition, she has been incredibly attacked. I've seen her from very close distance, and I have to say that this is a young woman with very clear ideas, with a very clear mind. She negotiated her participation to an extreme degree, and she also said that she would not open her mouth if the President of the Commission was not present during her intervention. I want to also say that something that surprises me of Greta is that she has an enormous sense of what is groupal, what belongs to a group. She comes from the Belgian movement for climate, and I have to say that almost all of these European movements are piloted by young women and also young women. So I think this is this opens enormous expectations, and I think that we are a new panorama or a new landscape is being open to all of us. I think this is one of the most important points in the Sustainable Development Agenda. I cannot address you my word any longer. I thank you for listening to me, and of course I'm at your disposal in case you have any doubts. Please do not hesitate to ask.
Muchas gracias, Isabel, por señalar una de las paradojas que hay en la Unión Europea.
Thank you, Isabel, for pointing out that some of the paradoxes of the European Union. Many institutions speak about the fight for equality, but then on an internal level there are a set of contradictions that, as long as they are not solved, it's going to be very difficult to tackle all these problems. Okay, it's 2:20. We have like a couple of minutes for the Q&A sessions. So raise your hands, but I'm going to say that once we finish the Q&A sessions, we're going to make a group photo here on the stage. And at 2:45, we will have our lunch downstairs. So Q&A session, and then the group photo. Thank you. Any hands? There's one.
Oh, just in case.
Bueno, perdón. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you very much. My name is Beatriz Sagrado, and I'm representing the state platform of women's organizations to abolish prostitution. My question is going to be addressing Sascha for Women's Major Group. I'm surprised because although we accept that from the 25-year-long kind of consideration, and it's true that we have a kind of backward moment where we are going backwards. I mean, why is there a subgroup that has been formed on violence? Speaking about the focus on sexual work, if we want to move forward in terms of equality policies, we need to have a very clear idea of what is behind prostitution, sexual exploitation, etc., pimps, etc. I would like to listen to your explanation to this. Thank you very much.
Sí, sí. Sascha, puedes responder, sí.
Sí. Entonces,
Answer. Yes, please.
so we have, in the global feminist movement, two positions. Both, I think, are trying to do the same thing, which is to get women out of sexual exploitation and abuse. And one movement, which is represented also by Spain, is the abolition movement, and the other movement, which is represented more by the Netherlands, is the legalization movement. But of course, we have to make a big difference. We have to make sure that we do not say that sexual abuse and exploitation should be legal. Of course not. Any form of forced prostitution should not be legalized, of course not. And we just know from our partners in the Women's Major Group that it's important that we listen to those who are themselves impacted. So we have many women who have either survived prostitution, forced prostitution, or who are still working in the sector, come and explain their positions to us. And these positions are different. If you are from Kenya, Zambia, wherever, Argentina, blah, blah, you might have a different position on how to protect the human rights of women who are currently either under forced prostitution or by choice working as sex workers. And as the Women's Major Group, we have to work on a global position. So we do not say that for your country, you need to do whatever, but we say that we have to work in solidarity with the women globally, and we have indeed a very strong call from particularly women in the Global South who say by the abolition approach, we will make it even more dangerous and there will be even more exploitation of women in that sector. And they have insisted that we try to find a way that we can understand that we have differences between European countries and other countries in the world on how to deal with some of the overall definitions, but that what we want is the same and that we focus on the results we want, and that is support for survivors, helping women to transit to other jobs, decent jobs, to make sure that they have their human rights fully respected, that they're not criminalized, and that they have access to all sexual and reproductive health rights and services. That is, I think, a common aim for all the feminists, even though we do have indeed different positions on which words to use. But since we work in global solidarity, we will need both. So we have a group working on sexual exploitation and abuse, one group, and we have one group working on sexual and reproductive rights, which has a subgroup specifically looking at sex workers, which is an international agreed language under the ILO. So that is the compromise we propose we have to work with in the global feminist movement. We should not be divided on this issue. It's too easy for our enemies to divide us. So that's our proposal to you. We have to work on this together, and this is the compromise we have proposed. Thank you.
Sí, por favor.
Bueno, me llamo Teresa Eci, soy del movimiento
My name is Teresa Eci. I come from the Navarra Civil Society movement. I just wanted to, well, I wanted to have the floor from before. I want to thank you, all of you that have spoken now, because I absolutely share your thought about working in a united way together, not to let anybody divide us. But I want to thank you and thank also the previous speakers. And of course, I want to thank the organizers, the Secretary of State, the Ministry, different organizations, and all of you women that have tried to gather us here. I'm sure that has meant a great effort. I want to say thanks because personally it has been very useful for me, or to me, to remember, because we must be very aware of the fact that what we're working for, what we're struggling for feminism, for equal rights, is really moving itself in a very moving land, and we have difficulties up over our heads and under our feet. And we need to see where the problems lay, but not over us only, but also under our feet, because we know that for our colleagues sometimes it is very difficult to convey the message of the budgets. We need to understand the budgets. We need to convey the meaning of budgets and also the efforts that all this means in our daily lives. I was speaking with some friends, and they were saying, yes, okay, you can do a lot of things, but I'm still charging or cashing only 10 euros per hour when I clean houses. And, well, the reality is out there with all its difficulty, and we must be very much aware of the moment, of the momentum and the boost, and why we see such attacks on the ideology of gender, and we need to be aware of the implications of all these topics. I mean, it's not only 3 or 4 things, the implications are much higher. And the message I want to convey is that we need to work in a joint way, and we will have impact up there with the efforts down there, and we will have an impact down there with the efforts up there. Thank you very much.
Sí, por favor.
Hola, buenas tardes. Hola, sí.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I add myself to the gratefulness of my colleague, to the organizers and the other colleagues, because all of us are learning here. I also wanted to speak first, or before, and the floor was not given to me. But there is a general question that I would like to launch to all of you and the previous speakers, which has a relationship with this backlash that Elena mentioned, related to these mechanisms of patriarchal reaction that neutralize the efforts to achieve a progress in gender equality. which neutralize the efforts of victims to get out of these situations of victimization. I am myself, I'm a victim, and I refer particularly to the PROSAP lobby organization that is working on a worldwide level, which is working on a level of social networks. And not only that, but also institutions trying to penetrate. And in fact, in some states, they have achieved this, although in Mexico, for example, this is regulated. They have successfully penetrated or introduced parental control as such as ex jure presumption, that is with no rule or regulation, in places where the sexual violence is, when it starts in a very early age, together with gender violence. They are trying to neutralize the strength of these victims to survive out of all these situations. The parental alienation or alien situation, interparental influencing. They are introducing all this through the figure of parental coordinator in the Cephilia Foundation. There are many articles being written, mainly in English, related to how this parental alienation influences in the courts of justice. This is harming the children and the mothers that are victims of violence. But I would like to know whether from the European Equality Institute or the European Union or the Council of Europe, these drafting ways are acting. I mean, they are very harmful for those women that are struggling and they never come out of these violence situations. It should be very important from these institutions to define very clearly what they are talking about when they mention this alleged syndrome or this aberration, if you know what I mean.
Caterina, could you please answer?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I didn't catch who you are and whom you represent, but thank you. It's obviously, maybe it's this or, okay. This is clearly a very hot topic, this intersection, claiming that children's rights to equal contact with parents needs to be upheld. We see the struggle between that and prevention of violence, protection against violence, violence that is direct or even witnessed. The witnessing is also violence suffered. We see this in coming out very clearly in the reports produced by Grevio, the independent body that is evaluating the Istanbul Convention, where the strong parental alienation lobby, even in Nordic countries, supposedly very advanced on gender equality, even so the backlash is happening everywhere. And in the reports, we are finding that very concrete language needs to be addressing precisely these dangers. So I don't know if this answers your question, but we're very aware of it. And in fact, we had a conference earlier in May this year that address this problem too, but we haven't found, let's say, a global solution yet. And I think here civil society has a very important role to play. But yes, the more of these Grevio reports coming out and squarely addressing the problem as it occurs, and for example, in some systems, children are obliged to spend time, this I'm sure you know, obliged to spend time and this time spent is used as stress against the mother, the victim of violence. So it's very, very complex right now, all in the name of equality of the parents. We are perpetrating further violence also against children. So we're very conscious of it, and it's proving to be a challenge, and we try to avoid it. We also have this other instrument, the Lanzarote Convention, which you may be aware of, on sexual exploitation of children, but more to do with the Istanbul Convention. We are finding that we're coming to a crucial moment where this tension is playing out, and unless we have bold action where we make even the prevention time, so courts need to be aware when they issue instructions, decisions, they need to be aware of all the risks and to act preemptively. And if that means that the child is not seeing typically the father as often as or under sort of unsupervised conditions, then this may have to be necessary. This is something that at least from the Council of Europe we are trying to be very strong about. Thank you.
Gracias, Isabel, Sascha, Caterina. No tenemos tiempo para...
Thank you, Elizabeth, Sascha, Caterina. We don't have any time for anything else. During the lunch break, you will have the possibility to exchange impressions and opinions with the rest of the people. No, it's okay. You were not very long. Thank you.